What I want to do is base the whole discussion on three things, really. One is a paper I produced in 1993 and eventually was awarded a European Prize on discourses on citizenship. And so that is the beginning of where the paper should be going. And the other bits are from what I've been publishing around the issues of globalization. There's 2 books just been published on globalization. And also recently about issues on war on terror. So I want to bring all those things together in the next 40 minutes, if I can, to show you my argument is going at the moment. And I hope that we can share some ideas. The first thing to do is to show you some images, which I think are important because images tell us stories, and the stories that really stick in our heads. And those stories which stick in our heads are important because they tell us what we think sometimes. So in terms of the war in Iraq, it seems to me the debate is, have we liberated the Iraqis, or do the Iraqis see themselves under occupation? Yeah, so that's one part of the images I want to show, but the thing is skipping a bit. Yeah, so here are some images of Iraq day to day. What is happening at the moment in Iraq. These are photos that were sent to me from Iraq, and I think what is missing about the war in Iraq is the whole human dimension to it. This picture, for example, we wanted to use it in our book because I think for children life seems to go on. They want to kick a ball around even if things around them are not sure. Children of Iraq. I like that picture in terms that the child is trying to come to terms and tilting his head to try and look the dead person in the eye. This is a series of images about Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. And again, Iraqi, and some pictures about globalization and China, because I think it also tells that here is China growing at a fast rate, and what are the implications of globalization in China. But I think I will send those photos to you. So what I want to do is start off here about my models of citizenship and talk about the idea that there are 5 shapings of citizenship going on. When you look at globalization, yeah, it seems that there are 5 type of perspectives viable in dealing and responding to globalization. The first I call the global public citizen, which seems to me to say that we've got to get to a point in our life of saying where I was born is no longer important. The geographical space of where I'm born is not important. That it is not the geographic space that gives me identity. And that is one of the challenges of globalization. Can we make that big jump to the idea of cosmopolitan citizen? How do we do that? How do we, in this more interconnected world, do we actually say, yes, here is globalization, and we all are interconnected more immediately today, and therefore, is it possible to create this idea of cosmopolitan citizen? I think you need to look at the argument of people like David Held, yeah, because I think David Held is one of the main proponents of the idea of cosmopolitan citizen. The second type of model is what I call the independent citizen model, which briefly actually says that your citizenship is better defined in the marketplace, in a market liberal economy. And it challenges ideas of politics, really. It actually says that the public space is corrupted, and therefore we should not look to the public space. So every time there are cases of corruption about the public space, it confirms this idea that we should not trust politicians and we should not trust the public space. And therefore the alternative is to rely on markets, that somehow markets are more just than politics. Markets are more just than politics in the simple sense that markets do not discriminate. They only discriminate in terms of prices. We need to make something of that argument, which actually says that as long as you can afford it, the market will not discriminate. The third is really in the tradition of social policy of people like Marshall, who argued the case of we needed to look at the three pillars of citizenship, what he called political rights, civil rights and social rights. So how do we equate the social rights bit in the context of globalization? So the social rights dimension, how do we start using it? The fourth, what I call a dutiful citizen, really can be seen as an attempt of retreat from globalization. Retreat in the sense that says identity is based on geographic spaces, identity belongs to history, tradition, authority, and it is those things that really define the nature of citizenship, that citizenship is still best defined within the boundaries of the nation state. And finally, it's really the work of people like Bauman, I think, and all his recent writings about fluid society, fluid modernity, liquid fear, liquid modernity, liquid love. He's written about 5 books recently about this idea of consumer society, that the more consumer society we become, I think his message is the more impotent we become. You can have all the goods you want as a consumer, but in that idea that you live your life as a consumer, actually all you're doing is disempowering, and I need to look at that. So for him, the idea of consumer society completely negates the idea of citizenship. That is the paradox. The more you drive towards consumer society, then the less likely it is to equate two things together, citizenship and consumer society. That consumer society negates all the arguments of citizenship. So let me try and expand on each of those. The global citizen model really is connecting to issues of democracy, is the issues of deliberate and deliberative democracy, what Barber called about the need to create thick democracy rather than thin democracy, the need to create a democratic culture. So the viability of creating global citizenship is making sure that global institutions from IMF, World Bank, WTO, how do we make them more globally accountable? How do we create more transparency at a global level? When you think that the WTO is supposed to be the most democratic of the 3 institutions in relation to IMF and World Bank, And yet I have just been in Nigeria, and one of the things that you learn about WTO is the inability of poor countries to influence WTO, except at meetings of summits. Basically, WTO meets every week in Geneva. And unless you've got the money, you cannot have offices in Geneva to actually get involved in intricate trade negotiation. Yeah, so I think when we're talking about capacity building, yeah, and how do you improve capacity building for poor countries so that they can have offices in Geneva to try and influence world trade. The IMF and World Bank are seen as the architects of the Washington Consensus in terms of, I want to say more about globalization in a while, of how do you see globalization? Yeah? How do you see it? Do you see it as this exogenous variable? Yeah? The exogenous variable in economic terms, yeah? How do you, in economic modeling, how do you deal with the exogenous variable? Yeah? The exogenous variable only gives you one response that you need to respond to it. Yeah? It's coming at you from the outside. So if you treat globalization as the exogenous variable, most of the time, the argument fails for me in that you're trying to put it in the same space as the nation state. How do you put globalization as a process in the same spaces as the nation state? Because what happens is that globalization is always bigger than the nation state. Yeah? So when you put those two together in the same spaces, then you're only left with one possibility, the possibility of how do you respond to this globalization which is coming at you externally. And the argument then goes, logically, yeah, the way to respond to globalization is you've got to be flexible, create flexible labor markets, make sure that your workforce is flexible, that they accept low wages, yeah, and the whole logic that goes with that. Yeah? And one of the arguments I've been trying to put forward is that globalization is being continuously defined and shaped. And therefore, if it's being continuously defined and shaped, then you've got to look at it in relations of issues of power, of who's doing defining and the shaping. Once you start getting to that bit of saying who's doing the defining and the shaping, you can then start mapping out the winners and losers of globalization. Yeah? And how do you do that? So, yeah, in terms of the global citizen, is it possible, I ask, to create an issue of cosmopolitan ethics? Yeah, cosmopolitan ethics in the sense that of common humanity, the possibility that we all look at each other as human beings with human worth. Is it possible to do that? And the issue of, therefore, universal human rights, yeah, and the whole debate that is going on around universal human rights, yeah, of universal human rights that will encompass the whole issue of personal dignity, not just human rights in terms of human rights procedure, but human rights in terms of access to water, in terms of access to the environment. Yeah? What creates universal human rights and personal dignity? And the issue of inalienable rights is important, yeah, that somehow we all have very short lives. Yeah? And in that short life that we all have, the idea that nobody should define for you what is the good society and put you in that situation that somebody is defining for you all the time what is good for you. And therefore the whole issue, the challenge is whether we can create the openness and transparency which is necessary to create this idea of the cosmopolitan citizen. Yeah, can we create that debate to show that it is possible to make transparent the issue of global institutions? So that one possibility, the possibility of digging up, the whole possibility of creating the notion of public citizen in the sense that makes politics important. The independent model, as I said, is market-driven, yeah? And I'm using the examples of the two extreme examples of the privatizations which went on in Russia and have gone on in Iraq. Yeah, I was in Russia at the time that Yeltsin decided to privatize everything. Yeah, and we went part of a team that actually said to Yeltsin to do it slowly. And he said to us, he said to his advisors, he said, I want these people out of the country. Yeah, because obviously he was not liking what we were saying. But we wanted to say, hey, do it slowly, do it gradually. And actually the argument from Yeltsin was, the quicker I privatize everything, the less likely that the communists will come back. Yeah, that was the whole argument. And the privatization in Iraq that was started by Bremner really was that everything, all institutions, education, health, had to be driven out and put into the private sector during the first 6 months after Bremner took over. Yeah, that basically Bremner reshaped Iraq without even discussing it with the Iraqis. That from in the future, Iraq health and education will be put in the private sector. And that's something that the Iraqis will have to live with. Yeah? But, yeah, so you can push something, a template of markets, and then people have to live with that for the rest of their lives, of trying to say, how do I make sense of the idea that everything that I have now is market-driven? Yeah, because in a period of transition, in that fog of transition, yeah, you reshape the contours for many generations to come. And the idea of negative liberty, yeah, that somehow negative liberty is important in terms that being at a distance from the state, yeah, the whole thing about the distance from the state, yeah, that the whole citizenship is better if there is distance between the individual and the state. Yeah, markets are more just than politics. And the whole notion that the more we publish and the more we point that the public space is corrupt and politicians are corrupt, then actually increasingly, yeah, basically you're creating this idea of an anti-politics. Yeah, that, every time there is a case of corruption, then basically what you're saying is the public space is not to be trusted, and that's something that needs to be said. And it drives towards this idea of individualism, yeah, that the public spaces are not there for us, not for us. I've said something already about the Washington Consensus. I've got so much to... The entitled citizen model of Marshall, yeah, putting it in a global sense, is to argue, yeah, the whole notion that the UN has been trying to push in recent years about political, social, and economic rights in terms of development. Yeah, how important is that? If you look at the case of the UK DFID, for example, who I've been working with, the notion of DFID is, if you look at DFID documentation, is that now DFID accepts that there's somehow a relationship between economic growth and social protection. Yeah, that poor nations should be spending more on health and education. Yeah, which is seen as somehow post-Washington or, yeah, but the problem is that it seems to me that it's still at the rhetorical level, right? Because when I was in Nigeria, we submitted a whole project to the FID about the Millennium Development Goals around one of the poorest states in Nigeria, an Oyo state, where 80% of the population are defined as being in poverty. And we prepared the project, and I spent weeks in Nigeria. And we took it to Abuja, which is the center, and lobbied in Abuja with the FID. And the whole notion of the senior civil servant in Abuja was, yes, you score highly on everything, yeah, but it's not something that the FID is a priority at the moment in terms of funding. So even though the language of the FID was saying, yes, we want to make this connection between social protection and development, actually when it comes to getting money in those priorities, the rhetoric is still lagging behind the reality of making money available. And that was my experience in Nigeria. And it was a bit disappointing, but I think increasingly in poor countries the argument is, which is being driven really by the World Bank, is the issue of good governance. You know, that if you want research income, then if you put any idea of good governance in developing countries and how do you strengthen democracy or good governance in developing countries, that it seems to me the main issue, right? That good governance is the focus of what do you do with resources, that somehow the problem is not a lack of resources, but that resources are being mismanaged. So increasingly, yeah, poor countries have embraced the Millennium Development Goals. Yeah? That is not a problem, yeah, of how you deal with the Millennium Development Goals. Yeah, and when poor countries are spending money to try and say, how do we achieve the Millennium Development Goals? Yeah, but I think it's still, again, this gap between rhetoric and reality of how committed is the West really to achieving those MDGs. I've already said something about Nigeria, that Nigeria for me as the case study, yeah, showed me the discrepancy that there is at the moment between the whole idea of commitment to social protection development and making money available for those issues. In terms of the dutiful citizen, yeah, increasingly it's a model of resistance. Yeah. You could see it as a model of resistance to Western influence. That globalization is seen as Western-driven, with Western ideas about human rights, or Western ideas about the Washington Consensus on Development. And the whole notion, therefore, that the issue of human rights, as it's being defined, is being defined on a West approach to what are human rights, without taking into account the issue of collective rights, the rights of communities. And that needs to be addressed. When I look at the debate about Islam, for example, and human rights, yeah, and that's a debate that needs to be looked at very carefully. Are we seeking to say something to countries, Muslim countries, that increasingly actually saying to Muslim countries that they are lacking behind somehow because their definition of human rights is not a Western definition of what are human rights. And I think that needs to be understood. The other thing is that in the terms of the dutiful citizenship, right, the whole idea that what gives us identity is our history. What gives us identity is collective memories. Is that what citizenship is about? Yeah. How important is that somehow the nation state and the boundaries of the nation state, it is the nation state that makes citizenship a reality? Is that right to say citizenship can only be anchored within the boundaries of the nation state? And the whole notion of imagined communities. I think it's important to understand that, right, because one of the debates about the war on terror is the failure, what Blair says is the failure of the Muslim community in Britain to integrate. And I ask myself, integrate into what? Unless you have some notion that there is this imagined homogeneous community, yeah, which you're asking young Muslims to integrate to. But when you say integrate, yeah, integrate into what? Right? Which bits do you want people? So if you start saying people are failing to integrate, then you have some notion that there's this homogeneous thing that people are failing to integrate into. Yeah? And basically, those people will fail. Yeah? It's a test of, you can never pass the test. Because at what stage do you say, I have integrated? Yeah? At what stage do you say, here is a tick, yeah? You've integrated? Yeah? Personally, I refuse to integrate. So, the consumer citizen of Bauman, I think it's important because I think there's a really interesting debate that's being had, and I hope you've got the chapter, yeah, and what I call the issue of the bliss and dark times, yeah. I think it's important to understand here are two major sociologists, right, Giddens and Bauman, looking at the same contours of life, yeah, and actually coming with so very different interpretation, right? In terms that Giddens seems to be saying, we are living in a world of bliss, yeah? We're living in consumer society now. We've got everything we want. And if you're unhappy, there is something wrong with you. Yeah? How could you be unhappy? And in that politics of bliss that Giddens talks about, for example, everything is about lifestyle. Yeah? So if you're ill, it's not a problem of health inequality, it's your lifestyle. Yeah? Have you eaten your muesli every day? Have you done exercise? You failed to exercise, therefore that's why you've got heart disease. Yeah? It's a lifestyle issue, and therefore it is interesting because in that consumer society, you've got all the information that you want. Right? So the problems that you have are lifestyle problems. Yeah? They are not problems of structure or power or inequality or living, dare I say, in capitalism. Yeah? Dare I say that word? Yeah? No, it's about bliss, what I call the politics of bliss. And the alternative to that, maybe that's where I belong, that you see things as dark times. Dark times in the sense that Hannah Arendt talks about, that the public space is no longer there to throw a light on issues that need to be debated. That the public space no longer fulfills that function. Because increasingly everything becomes highly individualized. The whole life experience becomes individualized. Yeah? You shop till you're dead on your feet. Yeah? And it's important to understand what the nature of consumer society is. Right? That, for example, poverty is no longer poverty, but it's being a flawed consumer. Yeah? That you can't take part in shopping. Yeah? Poor you. Yeah? So, and also I think it's about the war on terror, really, that there is a multiplication going on all the time of living with fear. Yeah, that the war on terror itself has contributed to the idea of fear. Yeah, that it's no longer just fear of corrupted public spaces, right? But fear in terms of seeing images of the Twin Towers or seeing images of people being blown up. Yeah, that what generates that fear? Right? Are we generating that fear? And citizenship is defined by what we have, not what we are. Your belongings define what you are, who you are. So in terms of Bauman, therefore, yeah, that is this idea, what you call impotence, that consumer society creates. Yeah, that the more you feel that here you are, you're a consumer, and therefore you're more empowered. Yeah, that increasingly consumer society does not fit in with any notion of citizenship. So those are my models that I have developed in terms of globalization. I've already said something. How do you treat it? Do you treat it as the exogenous variable that is happening to us, right? Or is it not permissible, really, to treat the two the same? Because maybe globalization is purely an academic concept that we can't even agree what the definition of globalization is. But to put it within concrete institutions, in relation to concrete institutions, and put it in the same geographical spaces with concrete institutions, then it creates a problem. Yeah? Because then it creates a problem of increasingly saying that the state is irrelevant, that the state is hollowed out, yeah? That the functions of the state have moved elsewhere, and the state plays on that. Yeah? The state increasingly plays on the notion that in the global world, people have got to compete in a global market, that the role of the state is limited to issues of education, increasing human capacity, human investment, limiting to the role of the state of making people more competitive in global markets. Because that becomes the only possible policy response. Is that right, to say that is the only policy response? And is it right to carry on then with the debate that the state has been hollowed out and the functions of the state are no longer relevant? And that takes you to the Bauman argument, right, that we can't look to the state. Yeah? And increasingly, by closing the door of the state, yeah, then issues become more individualized. In terms of the war on terror, yeah, the argument that everything changed after 9/11. Yeah. and how has everything changed since 9/11. I think there is this whole notion that the war on terror increasingly creates the us and them. The first speech that George Bush made was to say, you're either with us, and by definition, if you're not with us, you're against us. So polarizing the whole notion, that actually the war on terror has polarized. And is it right to use the concept or the notion of a war on terror? What contribution has that made? I think one of the things that it has done, it has demonized and dehumanized whole communities. That other communities start to be looked at as being less human. That when American soldiers, for example, went to Iraq, they brought with them in their heads a lot of racism, for example, that seeing Iraqi as desert niggers or lots of words were used in Iraq. And you can see that the whole notion of Abu Ghraib was not some aberrant behavior by a few soldiers below the rank of sergeant. And all those who were court-martialed that somehow for their aberrant behavior. And yet, when all those people gave evidence, it all came out the same, saying that people higher up knew what was going on, and they felt that people higher up had approved of the treatment of the detainees. The Patriot Act of 2001, which was approved in 2006, in a way, the Democrats found it very difficult to first of all, they didn't oppose the 2001 Act at all, in terms that they felt that they would be seen as treacherous. And it doesn't matter that they voted for years after Bush continued to beat them on the head, saying they're a bunch of bloody traitors and coddling to terrorists. So even when they vote for that legislation, they're not good enough. So the legislation again was approved in 2006, and the whole question on human rights in the United States is now passed into permanent legislation within the United States. For example, surveillance, wiretaps, the whole notion of trying to find out what books people read in the war on terror. And in our case in the UK, most probably the 2005 Act was the most political, in terms that the clause, for example, on glorifying terror, the government refused to define when glorification starts on the war on terror. But I think you've got to ask the question, why is it that government have favoured passing legislation which is ambiguous? Why do they favour ambiguity? And I think that takes us back to something that Duncan Campbell talked about many, many years ago, about a chilling effect. And the whole notion of the chilling effect is that you end up policing yourself. You police yourself in terms of what you're going to say. I remember being involved in the Right to Work campaign in 1975. And I received this anonymous letter from a senior civil servant saying I was on the P list. I didn't know what the P list was. But I said I was glad I was on the P list. Imagine if I wasn't. And I passed on the letter to Duncan Campbell, that I was on the P list, whatever that meant. And I still today don't know what that means, that I was in the P list in 1978 because I was on the Right to Work march as a student, full of bright ideas, saying that the Labour government was betraying the working class of England. And I marched on the Right to Work campaign because unemployment was rising. And I received a letter saying I was on the P list. And Duncan Campbell, at that time, introduced me to the whole notion of a chilling effect, that basically you start telling people, hey, you're being watched. Yeah? And if you tell people long enough they're being watched, yeah, the people are best at policing themselves. Yeah? You stop saying things. Now I'm getting grey hair, so I don't care anymore. But, but I think the other thing is that the anti-terror legislation has created that environment of a chilling effect. Yeah, that, and I think you need to think about. And also that somehow England, the UK was the exception from all the European countries, saying that somehow the environment, everything had changed so much that we needed to derogate from many clauses of the Human Rights Act in passing anti-terror legislation. Yeah? And to seek derogation from many clauses on human rights legislation. And I think in terms of the US, the legislation passed by the Bush administration, the worst aspect of that was to negate habeas corpus to all the detainees at Guantanamo Bay. Yeah, the people at Guantanamo Bay have no chance of having their cases reviewed by America. And yet habeas corpus is so important to the American Constitution. Yeah? So what does that say about written constitutions? Yeah? That even, yeah, what does it say? I don't want to say anything except that the only thing I want to say about that is the war in Iraq and other wars, that increasingly these wars are seen like video games. And that's a worrying aspect, that we've become spectators of a video game. That actually it's that is why I showed you those images, really, because wars are increasingly becoming dehumanized. I become shocked when I see photos of Iraq and the destruction of buildings. Yeah, because when you see pictures from the air, you see nothing. Yet when pictures are on the ground and people driving in Iraq, and there's not houses left on top of each other, yeah, that there's a dehumanization going on, the human element of war. And that is increasingly worrying. Yeah. Precision munitions creates this distance, yeah, that we become onlookers and on a video game. So I think surveillance, yeah, is part of that notion that maybe the reason why maybe there is no major protest about surveillance, because we are in comfort looking at other people. So if other people are looking at us, it's okay. Yeah, it becomes one. Yeah, we look at others and others look at us. So that is the new world. Yeah, that that we all seem to be happy with. I think the violation of human rights has got a long historical pedigree. And I think that is something we all need to understand, that the state has always used context somehow to challenge civil liberties. This is not something new. I think that is the thing I want to say. Yeah, whether, if you look at United States history, whether it was Lincoln in the American Civil War and the Seditions Act, yeah, or in the First World War under Woodrow Wilson, Seditions Act, Espionage Act, 1917, 1918, yeah. And under those acts, mainly communists were imprisoned for basically opposing the war, the First World War. Yeah. So, yeah, and it was people like Judge Brandeis who actually said, you know, that somehow freedom of speech is so important in a democracy that what people say, yeah, should not undermine somehow and challenge the state. I mean, I remember reading the poetry of Rutitskaya, yeah, and yet even here was Russia, yeah, spending all this money on defense, yet it could not cope with the poetry of Rutitskaya, and she ended up in a gulag, you know. So I think there is a whole history about violation of rights, you know, of individual rights. So it's nothing new. I think that's something that needs to be said, that the violation of human rights is not something new. And I think, again, it's a question, really. Why does the state find opportunities to put a question on civil liberties? Yeah, that even when you have written constitutions, and how it doesn't matter how good that written constitution is, yeah, that written constitution has no meaning until people actually fight for what is written in that constitution. That yeah, written constitution will not guarantee your rights, yeah, until you do something about it. Until people resist and say, these are my rights, then written constitutions will not protect your rights. Just because, here's the constitution, I'm okay, I am safe. Well, we're not safe. And I think the last case I mentioned, that is the Japanese internment in the Second World War, yeah, that, as described as aliens and needed to be interned.